has kindly gave us a list of reviewers, and we recently reported back of the volunteer reviewers how many we used. And Dr. Jason can give you an update if you know the specifics. And he kindly told us that he appreciated that. We promised to tell everyone within a year after receiving your list of volunteer reviewers how we did. Not everyone can review for us because of conflicts of interest. But we tend to use as many people as you recommend to us who have the credentials for peer review to use them in our study sections. And so we held 1,400 different study sections or review meetings last year. And the individuals who do the work are the scientific review officers, and we have currently 240 of them at the Center for Scientific Review. So this is 2009. It's business as unusual as it can get. Because, it's a wonderful thing that so many people came in with new grant applications and new ideas that it really pushed us beyond our capacity. But we did, nevertheless, perform peer review in a very short period of time. Those of you who have participated as reviewers or applicants in the challenge, we received 20,000 applications for just the challenge program alone. And with all of the other grant programs through the Recovery Act, we received 115,000 applications to review for fiscal year 2009. And we almost tripled the number of reviewers we needed to review all of those applications. And we had many, many more meetings. And so along the way, Dr. Zahuni, when he was director of NIH, declared 2008 the year of peer review. Not that anything was wrong, but we really needed to adjust the way we do peer review to the current trends in science and efficiencies through the electronic age. And so one of the things that happened early on was to respond to the request to speed the funding of meritorious science and reduce the burden on reviewers. Until November of last year, you could submit an original grant application and 2 revisions if you were not successful the first time. The problem in peer review is that very few first-time grant applicants were being funded because reviewers had a tendency to say, you need to fix this or that, come back. And so we were particularly mindful of this because new investigators or junior investigators were really not able to wait. And so the goal was really to expedite our reviews as well as reduce the number of revisions or amendments to just 1. So you basically have 2 chances to go through the peer review process. And the goal for applicants is to write the application as if you don't have to write it again, and for the reviewers to review it as if they were never going to see it again. Give very cogent, succinct commentary back to the applicants. So this was implemented, and as of January of this year, you can only come in with an original and 1 new application. Next was this issue of what happens to new or junior investigators. And until recently, the NIH definition of a new investigator was anyone, regardless of where you are in your career stage, who has not successfully competed or received NIH support. And so it was that category where very senior investigators who received private foundation funding or such things as Howard Hughes or VA funding or Department of Defense funding were considered new to NIH because they didn't have NIH support. So through input from the communities, we decided that we really needed to focus on a better definition of what new meant and focus on where an applicant is in their career stage. And so a new term, early stage investigator, was defined as someone who is within 10 years of their terminal research degree for PhDs or for an MD, a clinician, any clinician. It could be a veterinarian or a physical therapist, that within 10 years of completing a residency or equivalent. And anyone who thinks they're outside of those years for a reason, we will look at those on a case-by-case basis. There are people who take a break in between residencies or postdocs, and we will look at those on a case-by-case basis. The reason it's important to identify early-stage investigators is because you get a break in peer review, particularly for R01 applications. There is a mandate for the NIH to support as many new early stage investigators, and so the pay line for those R01 applications is much better, sometimes twice as good as for established investigators. In peer review, until recently, the early stage investigator applications and established investigator applications were all reviewed together. Right now, what we're doing is clustering or reviewing all of the early stage investigators in a group so that they're only competing against each other and not against others who have a longer track record of publications or of preliminary data. And reviewers are reminded of this during the peer review. So I always have a take-home message. I didn't give you the first message. It's a little out of sync. I'll tell you what the first message is in a minute. But if you know someone, one of your colleagues, or in any field that's an early stage investigator, they should apply now because the break in review still exists and the mandate for funding as many new investigators still exists also. So it's a great stimulus for people who are entering particularly this domain. You want to get as many people interested in chronic fatigue syndrome. And this is a real incentive. But what you need to tell junior faculty is, I'm going to say this very clearly, that they should not submit R21s or the smaller grant application mechanisms because there is no break for those. There is no differential in the pay line for junior investigators and senior investigators as there is for the R01s. So that's really the take-home message. And again here, this is just to repeat that. It's really such a critical message. I think it's really one of the biggest messages to take home. The other thing that changed is how the applications will be formatted as well as how they're reviewed. The overall score that the application receives in peer review is based on the overall impact of the research. That's the number that's going to get percentiled. And a simple definition is the assessment of the likelihood of the project to exert a sustained, powerful influence on their field. Another way to think about that, when particularly reviewers are reviewing clinical research, is whether anyone will use it, do it, or take it. And if the answer is no, then that research project probably doesn't have much impact. So the overall impact is scored now from 1 to 9. But when you received your critique, the summary statements, it's 10 to 90, where 10 is the best scored application. The application is also scored on 5 key criteria: significance, investigator, innovation, approach, and environment. And each of those are scored from 1 to 9 as well. In the past, those were the same criteria, but they weren't scored. And until recently, about half of the applications that go to study sections are not discussed and not scored. But applicants wanted to know how close they were to being discussed. And so you received a score if your application was discussed in study section and were unscored if you didn't. Now, if your application is in the top half, you'll certainly be discussed. You will also receive an overall impact score. And you'll also receive the criterion scores from the 3 assigned reviewers to your application. The not discussed group, the lower half, will receive the scores on the 5 core criteria. So you'll have more information about where you were, and those numbers should correspond to the narrative that you'll get in the summary statement. So this, in your slides that you'll see, it's in a little bit more detail here again. All applications will receive scores. The discussed applications receive the criterion scores in addition to the overall impact score. And percentiles still will occur, and those also are now not in whole numbers from, 1 to 91. The priority scores will be from 10 to 90. So those of you who have received these already, this started in May, the review round that was in May, so there are applicants who've received the new scoring. And you may ask, why are we changing this? And so until May, applications were scored from